in, and they met in a house in a neighborhood that was sort of tough to cover. And of course, you're always hesitant when you send undercovers in the house. And we knew there were at least 7 or 8 Mexican nationals in the house. And we were in a van. I was part of the raid entry team. There were 8 of us. And I remember we're sitting down in a driveway. The house was for sale, and we're sitting in the driveway monitoring the cal equipment, the transmitter that the undercover had on. And we had a prearranged by bus. He was going to verbally let us know it was all right to come. But the plan was for them to exit the house, and then we were going to get the house, because we knew there were people in there and they were armed. And he gave the verbal by bus when he's in the house. So myself and another agent are listening to the cal, and I said, hey, he just gave the bus signal. And one of the senior agents said, we are not going until they come out of the house. And I said, I'm listening to the cal, and he just gave the bus signal. We got to go. So there was a very heated exchange in the van, and we ended up hitting the house with the undercovers in. And I think we got probably 100 or 150 kilos of coke.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name's Joe Kirkland. I was a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 28 years. Grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania, but I moved around a lot. My dad worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so I think we moved 7 times when I was growing up. We ended up moving back to northwestern Pennsylvania when I was in 8th grade. And I had 3 sisters, 2 older, 1 younger. They're all back in Pennsylvania, and I left and never really returned other than to visit. Always thought I'd end up there, but it didn't work out. My dad worked for the Pennsylvania Game Commission for 10 years, and then he went to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a special agent, and that's how I got interested in law enforcement. And again, we moved. We lived in Colorado, St. Louis, Delaware, New Jersey. Our last move was from St. Louis to northwestern Pennsylvania, back to where I was originally from. And my dad was stationed in D.C. at the time, so he'd drive the 5 or 6 hours back from D.C. every weekend. And then eventually, his last 7 years on the job, he worked out of our house, and he was part of a special operations group for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they did a lot of undercover work targeting people dealing in illegal animals and animal parts. So the fact that he had his office in our house, I was exposed to a lot of aspects of his work. And in fact, I remember he was doing a reptile case out of Atlanta, Georgia, and he'd receive reptiles through the mail, some legal, some illegal, and he'd have to take photos of them. And I'd hold everything from rattlesnakes to Gila monsters when he'd take evidence photos. And then those reptiles would end up either in the Atlanta Zoo or the Pittsburgh Zoo. So I was always fascinated with his job and law enforcement in general. Went to college out of high school at Lock Haven University, small school in central Pennsylvania, Division II school, majored political science, ran cross country there for 3 years. That was a great part of my college career. I was a mediocre runner, but got to brush shoulders with some really good athletes, and learned a lot about hard work, and had a great coach. And we'd run twice a day and 60, 80 miles a week, and I'd get dragged along with everybody. And I'm still in contact with my coach and still in contact with a lot of really good friends that I developed through that process. Good school. My junior year, I went overseas on an exchange program to Poland, and that had a big impact too on my law enforcement career. Just gave me a good idea of geopolitics between the different countries in the United States. And of course, in Poland, there were a lot of crazy things going on politically. It was still behind the Iron Curtain, and one of the Soviet bloc countries, and they ended up shutting down the school 6 weeks early because they were having an election, a general election, and they thought all the students were going to riot nationwide and disrupt the elections. So they shut school down early, and I had a little money left, so I ended up traveling, hitchhiking through Europe for 6 weeks till my airline ticket was due in Luxembourg, and I flew home. So that was a really good experience internationally for me. And then my senior year, I thought hard about law enforcement, tried to apply to some local agencies because I really wanted to stay in Pennsylvania after moving so much as a kid. I loved that area. Where I grew up was very rural. We had a beautiful river that ran through town, good fishing and hunting, which I enjoy doing very much. And I couldn't find a job with any of the local departments. Nobody was hiring. So I decided, well, I'm going to go into the Marine Corps. Went down to Pittsburgh, was going to join the Marine Corps, went through a battery of tests for 2 days, passed everything. I was in great shape, flew through the physical fitness. And at the end of that, they said, we can't take you because when I was in high school, I had a football injury and knocked a couple vertebrae out of place and had them fused together. And they said, it's not going to work. So that was a major disappointment for me, and also sort of a springboard to pursue my law enforcement career. Because I couldn't get a job locally, I applied to grad schools, got in, went to Northeastern in Boston, Massachusetts. And the first year I worked as a research assistant, which paid for my tuition. And I worked for the chairman of the department and did research on whatever project he was working on. Spent a lot of time in the libraries. They had a consortium of libraries in Boston, and I hit them all that first year doing research for this gentleman. And then the next year they offered me a teaching assistant position, and I did that. And it was a 2-year program, and I really thought I was going to go on and try to get my PhD and become a teacher, and started to apply to programs. And in January of that year of '87, I shotgunned a vacancy announcement for Customs, ATF, and the Immigration Service, and I think one other federal agency. And in March, I got a call from the Immigration Service, and they wanted me to come to DC for an interview, and I couldn't because of my workload there at the university. And I did the interview over the phone, had my feet up on the desk, and was in a t-shirt and shorts, I think, and did the interview. But I got the job, and I did make one mistake. They asked me at the time they were going to hire me as a GS5, which was about $15,000 a year. And they said, are you going to be able to live on that? And at the time, I was living in Boston on like $8,000 a year. And half the time, I didn't know if my pickup truck was going to start. And I told them, hell yeah, that's plenty of money. Well, it was the wrong answer, because once I showed up for the job, they had actually been authorized to hire me as a GS7 or a GS9. So I ended up as an 1811 special agent with the Immigration Service as a GS5.
Wow. Can you think about, Joe, back when you were a kid or you saw what your dad was doing, was there something in particular that kind of sparked that interest of going into law enforcement?
Well, there's a funny story, actually. My dad, I'm probably the only DEA agent that grew up with a picture of J. Edgar Hoover hanging in our house. Because my dad, when he first got out of high school, the FBI was recruiting people right out of high school to be fingerprint examiners. So he got a job. He graduated when he was 17 years old. Got a job with the FBI as a fingerprint examiner, went to Washington, D.C., met J. Edgar. At the time, J. Edgar Hoover would have all the new employees come into his house or into his office, give him an autographed photo and a copy of the poem by Rudyard Kipling, If. So my dad had those, and he worked for the FBI for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and then the Korean War broke out. And he enlisted in the Navy, and after he got out of the Navy, he moved back home and was a machinist for a while, and then went to work for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. So the whole time I was growing up, he'd say, hey, it'd be great. You could become an FBI agent. So when I got on with INS, they sent me down to FLETC, to Quantico, or to Glencoe, Georgia for 17 weeks. Great training, criminal investigative training, firearms, vehicle training. It was Spanish, immigration law, really good 17-week course. But when I was down there, I bumped into some DEA agents that were there for language training. So like the second week, I see them and I get to talking with them and I think, geez, that sounds really interesting. So when I get back to DC out of the academy, I'm a DEA agent or an INS agent. And about a year into the job, I applied to DEA. And that's how it started.
So I take it you didn't work a whole bunch of cases with INS before you got hired with DEA?
Well, I did actually,
Okay.
because when I got there, they assigned me to a criminal alien squad. And at the time, DC was on fire with crack cocaine. I mean, it was the murder capital of the nation. And they had a lot of, El Salvador was in the middle at the tail end of the Revolutionary War. They had a lot of El Salvadorian immigrants. The Jamaicans were in control of the crack cocaine trade at the time. And their business plan was just move into a neighborhood, kill the competition, and take it over. So we worked almost on a weekly basis with Metro PD and DEA because a lot of these immigrants were previously deported as violent felons or had drug convictions, and then they'd just come back in. And being an INS agent, we had a lot more authority to arrest people. We didn't need to catch them with drugs or guns or part of a drug conspiracy if they were here in the country illegally or a re-entry after deportation. We could get the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute that. So I was only with INS 3.5 years, but had a lot of good grand jury time, testified a bunch, and the cases were simple. We determined this guy was a previous deportable, had been previously deported, and we'd go before the grand jury and get a warrant for his arrest and go get him. So we arrested a lot of people in conjunction with Metro PD and DEA.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I think of INS in particular, I think of obviously the border, and then I think of rural agricultural communities. I certainly don't think of DC. So especially when you're talking about working with Metro PD and DEA, I mean, I'm sure you saw a lot of good stuff.
It was a lot of had some exciting moments. It was so bad, the violence. They started, it was called MADCAP, Metropolitan Area Drugs Criminal Apprehension Program, and they had a team from the INS office in Washington, D.C., and also from Baltimore. They put us at an offsite, got us special tactical training from Maryland PD. They had a really high-speed tactical team, so they sent us through training with them, and then also through tactical training with some other federal entities in the Washington area. Got some good training, and we were out pretty consistently helping execute search warrants and arrest people in DC.
Did INS, I've talked to other people who were with INS and they went to the border and they had to test out for Spanish and stuff like that. You having gone to DC, did you have to have those same requirements to test at the same proficiency level with Spanish?
They did send us through Spanish training as part of that 7-week course. And I had a couple years in college. And then later DEA also sent me to some Spanish training. So I had some a good basis. I was never a very good Spanish speaker, but I could speak enough to get by.
But you didn't have to pass a certain like 3.5 in order to.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. Yeah. Was there any particular? I mean, it seems like you're having typical cases, a lot of drug stuff having to do with Metro and DEA. Was there any cases that kind of stood out to you what year or what age were you when you started?
I was 24.
24. So as a 24-year-old, was there any cases where you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this?
We did a lot of, in the 7th District, Southeast DC. They have a lot of parks in the metropolitan area of DC, and the park police, they had a drug unit that worked with Metro PD. So we worked a lot of those parks. I mean, they were open air drug markets. And one of the things we do is jump outs. They'd have a van, and there'd be 8 of us in the van suited up, and they'd send an undercover in and make buys or use surveillance techniques to identify the people that were purchasing the drugs. And we'd hit the buyer as they were leaving, and then we'd go back and hit the seller in the park.
Wow.
So a lot of late nights, jump outs, we used to call them, and people would run. Everybody seemed to run or fight. And yeah, DC was an amazing place to work after 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I'm sure you got some great experience, and it only prepared you for when you went to DEA.
Yes. And the fact that we were working with them so frequently, whenever DEA had an operation, there always seemed to be some type of alien connection. So they would invite us along, and that just encouraged me to put in my application. It was a little discouraging because it took 2.5 years for me to go through the process. And after the first year, I was like, this is sort of ridiculous. So at my dad's encouragement, I applied to the FBI, went through their whole process. It took 9 months to the day I submitted my application till the day they were done. And I was scheduled to start with the FBI in December of 1990. And I'm calling the DEA recruiter and said, hey, I've been through the process with the FBI. It took them 9 months. I'm going on 2.5 years here. Is there... And at the time, FBI did our backgrounds for the DEA. I said, am I missing something? Is there a reason why this is taking so long? So in November, the beginning of November, they call me on a Thursday. DEA calls me and says, hey, we need you to be in the office on Monday if you want this position, and we have an academy slot for you in November. And I'm like, well, I have to give my employer at least 2 weeks notice. And the administrative person was saying, listen, this is your opportunity. If you want the job, you'll be here Monday. So I went in and talked to my boss and explained to him. And we went out and talked to the administrative lady. And she said, there's no way in hell you're leaving here by Monday. You just cannot do it. And my boss said, go step out in the hall, Joe. And he took care of it and got all my paperwork done that Friday. And Monday I reported to DEA.
So was there any trepidation taking the DEA position, knowing that you might have been able to go with FBI?
Well, I called my dad right away and said, hey, Dad, looks like I'm going to be a DEA agent. And he said, you're making a horrible mistake. He said, the FBI is the greatest law enforcement agency in the world. You're making a terrible mistake. And then my second call was to the FBI recruiter. And he told me the same thing. We're 10 times the agency they are. Why would you want to go with them? We have you scheduled for this academy slot in December. And I said, well, sir, thank you very much, but I'm going to be a DEA agent.
So what was the decision in your mind why you chose to go with DEA?
Well, we were working, like I said, almost on a weekly basis with them. And they were hard charging, case making, running confidential sources, executing search warrants, and you could just tell they were a dynamic group of people that were making a difference in DC at the time. So
I'm curious. So I'm curious then, knowing that you had made that choice, you get sent to the DEA Academy, and DEA and FBI are being housed at the same location at the same time. Did you notice a difference between the training, and was there anything going on during that training that you went, yeah, I think I might have made the right choice?
We were more paramilitary, lot of running, physical fitness, firearms. And at the time, the motto was speed, surprise, and violence action. Every day in the gym when we were doing defensive tactics training or going for a 6-mile run, they drilled that in your head. Hey, you're going to be dealing with dangerous people in dangerous environments, and you have to be prepared. I thought the training was outstanding. I had great training at FLETC, Georgia, but the training at the DEA Academy was outstanding. It was,
But I guess the question was, when you were back there and you saw, because you see the FBI guys doing their thing as DEA is doing their
Yes.
thing. Was there any point in your mind going, yeah, I see the difference. I'm glad I went this way, or was there ever, I guess I could have done that?
They were just more relaxed. You'd see them walking down the hall with their books in their hands, and wherever we were going, we were running or moving very quickly. And whenever we encountered somebody in the hall, it was always yes, ma'am, yes, sir. And they weren't nearly as disciplined as us. Not to say they weren't getting great training. I'm sure they were. I have
Sure.
a lot of respect for the FBI, and I've worked with some outstanding FBI agents, and it was just a different mindset.
Okay. All right. So you go through DEA Academy, you get transferred. Where's your first office?
Well, I get to the WDO out of the academy, go back there, and at the time they were trying to move agents out within a week or 2 weeks to their new destination, and I was selected for the Tucson district office in Tucson, Arizona, which I was excited about that. I would have been excited to go anywhere, but we had a bunch of people that ended up in New York or LA, and Tucson was a much better spot in terms of work, I think, and living. But however, when I got to the WDO, the Washington Division Field Office, they asked me, hey, would you be willing to stay 4 months? And they had, again, DEA was just overwhelmed at the time, as was Metro PD and all the other federal agencies. They had a joint task force group with ATF. I think they called it ACES, Armed Criminal Enforcement Studies. It was a project ATF was working on. Basically, they brought guys in from all over the country, TDY, and they were working with DEA and Metro PD to target these crack cocaine organizations. So I got to stay 4 months. They sent me with some other DEA guys through additional tactical training with ATF and some other federal agencies, some additional firearms training with DEA, and then for 4 months, that's what I did. We were at an off-site location, and we helped target these crack cocaine organizations, execute a lot of search warrants, did a lot of buy busts, and it was fun, a fun 4 months.
Yeah. Well, did you notice a difference working in DC as a DEA agent versus an INS agent, or it was pretty much the same kind of just switch of missions?
I think DEA was a little bit better organized, and they do enforcement operations just one after another. With INS, oftentimes I'd get 3 warrants and I'd just say, hey, you available? And it'd be me and one other guy in Southeast DC. We'd hook up with the uniformed officer and call dispatch to let them know we were in the area. But with DEA, they were much better at risk management.
Okay.
They did a better job.
Okay. So you get to Tucson what year?
June of '91.
Okay. And how many groups are in Tucson at the time?
There were probably 30 agents there at the time.
Okay.
30 agents and probably another 20 or 25 task force officers.
Was there a specific group that you were assigned to that worked a specific thing, or what was your assignment once you got to Tucson?
I was assigned to the BANG unit, Border Area Narcotics Group. It was a group. The group supervisor was Tommy Gomez, one of the best bosses I've ever had. And we were a station in a trailer over at the Border Patrol station. We had 3 or 4 plainclothes Border Patrol agents that were assigned to our group. And we were general enforcement, doing undercover buys, doing reverses, helping other groups with surveillance or helping them when they needed search warrants executed.
Any cases stand out to you, or anything that was interesting that happened to you back in Tucson?
Well, we also had a lot of, I mean, Tucson was a hub for the distribution of drugs. We had people come from LA, San Diego, Chicago, New York, and they'd all come down there to buy large quantities of drugs. So, yeah, we had some big cases. There was one out of New Mexico. I remember we had a couple of DEA agents come from Mexico, undercover guys, and they were negotiating with a significant group out of Mexico, and took like a week and a half. But finally, the meet was to come to fruition, and they met in a house in a neighborhood that was sort of tough to cover. And of course, you're always hesitant when you send undercovers in the house. And we knew there were at least 7 or 8 Mexican nationals in the house. And we were in a van. I was part of the raid entry team. There were 8 of us. And I remember we're sitting down in a driveway. The house was for sale, and we're sitting in the driveway monitoring the cal equipment, the transmitter that the undercover had on. And we had a prearranged by bus. He was going to verbally let us know it was all right to come. But the plan was for them to exit the house, and then we were going to get the house, because we knew there were people in there and they were armed. And he gave the verbal by bus when he's in the house. So myself and another agent are listening to the cal, and I said, hey, he just gave the bus signal. And one of the senior agents said, we are not going until they come out of the house. And I said, I'm listening to the cal, and he just gave the bus signal. We got to go. So there was a very heated exchange in the van, and we ended up hitting the house with the undercovers in. And I think we got probably 100 or 150 kilos of coke. And then when outside perimeter is there, another vehicle shows up with a Mexican national driving it. Why he came down that street, because there was already a uniformed vehicle down there. It didn't have its lights on, but it was in front of the house. And we got another 100 keys out of the trunk of that car.
Wow.
And nine or 10 Mexican nationals in the house, several long guns, AK-47s and handguns. And of course, afterwards, when we're back briefing it got heated again, because I was adamant, hey, we got to go. And I was sort of a junior guy, but I had my experience from INS, DC, and that guy had given the bus signal. And the group supervisor, it was an acting group supervisor, Tommy Gomez was out of town. Well, the undercover said, hey, I made a mistake. I gave the verbal bus signal in the house. I got so excited when I saw the cocaine, all the bundles of cocaine, instead of walking out to the car and putting the trunk up and being outside the house. He said, I made a mistake and got excited. So we did the right thing by hitting the house, and luckily nobody got injured or hurt.
Good. Okay. Tucson, how old were you when you started in Tucson?
27 and a half, 28.
Okay. So DEA, undercover, anybody could do undercover if they want it.
Yes.
Did you get to do any undercover?
Yes. Yes, I did.
And how was that? And how was your first experience, and how was it as 27-year-old guy going, okay, this is what I'm going to do? What's the mindset as you do your first undercover?
Well, Tommy Gomez was real supportive. But the first deal I did, I had a call from North Dakota. They had busted somebody during a bike rally up there, and they got a couple keys of coke on him. And he's a real big guy, 6'4", had long hair, tattoos all over. So I get the duty call. I said, yeah, send the guy down, because he claimed he could come down and meet these Mexicans and buy 10 or 15 keys of coke. So I said, send him down. So they brought him down, and I told Tommy, hey, I got this guy coming in. He's going to come down. We're going to sign him up for an informant. He says he can introduce an undercover to these Mexicans. So we get to the airport. It's myself and another agent, and this guy gets off, and he's got a vest on with no T-shirt underneath it. The vest is open, tattoos all over his chest. Real big guy, probably weighed close to 300 pounds, and typical biker gear. And he walks down, and I said, "Hey, I'm Joe Kirkland, and this is my partner, Bob, the agent that was with me." And he said, "Hey, I was told I was going to do the undercover work with a guy named Joe. That's not you, is it?" And I said, "Yes, it is." He goes, "That's bullshit. I'm not doing it with you. There's no way you can do the undercover work." And I told him, "Well, then turn around, get a ticket, and get on the plane and go back to North Dakota and do your time."
What was his issue? Why didn't he like you?
Well, I had short hair, and he just wanted a guy with biker garb. So when we get back to the office, my partner says, and we had some guys in the office that could have gone and done undercover anywhere with any biker. And my partner, Bob, says, "Hey, Joe, if we want this deal to go, we better get one of these other guys to do the undercover work." I said, "Bob, it's my CS, my confidential source. I'm doing the case. I'm doing the undercover." So I talked to Tommy, and Tommy says, "Hey, no problem. You can do it." So we end up setting the deal up on a Wednesday. Deal doesn't go. Set it up on Thursday. Doesn't go. Friday doesn't go. And there were some senior guys in the group. And at that point in time in DEA, it wasn't unusual to really give people a rough time. And they were dragging me through the dirt verbally, giving me a rough time over this case. And so then Sunday morning, I get a call from a confidential source. "Hey, we can do the deal this afternoon." So after making these guys stand in the heat over 100 degrees for 4 days, now I'm calling them on a Sunday. And I called Tommy. I said, "Hey, Tommy, we can do the deal this afternoon." "Great, let's do it." So I call the other agents in the group, and they really gave me a lot of verbal abuse over that. But we get out there, we set the deal up. They were to meet me in a hotel room. I had a couple $100,000 in cash, a flash, and they show up. I show them the money. We agreed to meet later at an apartment complex, and I went over there and saw the coke, tested it, walked out, and the raid team went in and hit it. And I don't remember what we got. They wanted to sell us 3 or 5 before. I think it was 5 kilos of coke, but we were negotiating for 15 or 20.
Any other assignments while you were in Tucson?
Yes. In 92, Snowcap was sort of a headquarters, a big deal with headquarters, and they were recruiting.
And just for the audience, can you explain what Snowcap was?
Snowcap was a program, an eradication program that DEA was running in Central and South America. I think it involved 9 countries, but they were sending agents down there to work with host nationals to target incoming shipments of cocaine and drugs that were landing in Central America and then being portaged on to Mexico and into the United States.
Okay. So did you do Snowcap?
Yes, I did. In 92, I threw my name in the hat, myself and another agent, my buddy Paul from Tucson. He was a former Chicago PD cop and military police officer. And he wasn't even off probation yet, but because of his experience, they let him throw his name in the hat as well. And they sent us down to Fort Benning, Georgia in the summer of 92. And we went through a week of assessment selection. I think there were 70 of us roughly, maybe 75. And during that week of assessment selection, we lost quite a few people. Not a lot of sleep. They run you PT, make you do the obstacle course and rock with a heavy pack. And
Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it a lot like Ranger School?
Well, it's the 4th Army Ranger Training Battalion that put on the training. I'm hesitant to say that it's
right.
like
No,
Ranger School because I got a lot of respect for the real Rangers, but it was a tough week of assessment and a selection. And of course, I'd never been in the military. We had a former Army Ranger in the group that had been part of the 4th Army Ranger Training Battalion. We had a former Navy SEAL, a lot of former military people. So a lot of good people in that group. I'd never been in the military, so it was all new to me. But we were wearing Army uniforms, and they immersed you in that culture pretty quickly. And of course, a lot of people dropped. They couldn't do the physical fitness standards.
So never having been in the military, what made you want to do Snowcap?
I really thought eventually I'd go overseas with my career. I thought that'd be a good stepping stone. Plus, it sounded exciting. I thought the training would be fun, and
Okay.
it was. It was very challenging. Like I said, they didn't give you a lot of sleep. And
So how many deployments did you end up having with Snowcap?
well, I only did one,
Okay.
and that was a disappointment for me because you did that week of assessment selection. Then we went back for 8 weeks. Of course, we lost some more people during that additional 8 weeks of training. And then they sent us that November to 6 months language school. So that was 92, May of 94. I went back to Tucson. And of course, in between this training and language school, I'm trying to work cases and help my group because management in Tucson, they didn't like losing people and you being gone that long. So then in January of 94, I had my first deployment and went to Guatemala. Initially, we had 10 days of mount out where we did all our weapons qualifications and a boat handling course and land navigation. And then we flew down to Guatemala in a C-130. Some of the guys stayed there. Myself and another agent were sent to Honduras. And we were in Honduras for 90 days working with the host nationals and, of course, the in-country DEA agents.
And anything, I mean, you said it was kind of a disappointment. Does that mean you didn't get to do very much? Or?
No, during our deployment, it was exciting. We had a Chinook helicopter and like 30 host nationals, and we were getting all kinds of intel in. And when we got intel, we'd do an operational plan, and the helicopter would land at the soccer field in Tegucigalpa, and we'd load up and go do the mission. So it was fun. We hit some boats, hit a house on one of the islands, and seized drugs and arrested people. And it was a fun 90 days. We were very busy, and my Spanish improved immensely during that 90 days because the host nationals we were with, they didn't speak any English at all. So
okay. So I'm curious, Joe, now that you've been with DEA for so many years and you're doing all this stuff, which I would consider pretty high speed, does your dad ever change his opinion? It
was funny. He did eventually after he came down to my graduation at the DEA Academy and was there. And he was just glad I was in law enforcement and working hard and passionate about the job.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're in Tucson for how long?
9 years.
9 years. Okay. And at some point during that 9 years, or after that 9 years is done, you get transferred. How does that all work? And where do you go?
Domestic transfers were really hard to get at that time in DEA. And I had looked at some overseas jobs. Some of the guys, we had a really good group in Tucson, general enforcement group. And then we started doing wires. And 1 year we received the administrator's award for all the wires we did. Had some hard-working agents in the group. And several of them had rotated through, were in Colombia or in other countries. And I was thinking really hard about going overseas. But when I was in Tucson in 96, my wife went back to school and went to medical school at the University of Arizona. And we had one child when she went into school. We had another child in between her 2 years. And my priorities changed pretty rapidly. And that's why I only did one Snowcap tour, because when I left on that first one, I had a 10-month-old baby. And then when I got back, I was actually planning on doing another one shortly thereafter. But we had that plane crash in Peru in August of 94 and lost us 5 agents in the plane that crashed in the jungle. So Snowcap, after that, they started dropping off on the deployments. Constantine was our administrator. He wasn't a big fan of foreign ops, and they ended up shutting that program down. So I only got that one tour in. My wife went back to medical school. We had kids, and she had just finished medical school, and she was trying to figure out where she was going to do her residency, and domestic jobs were really hard to get. Luckily, my ASEC at the time, Jay Woolley, former Chicago PD guy, he really liked me. My last 2 years in Tucson, as I mentioned before, I was assigned to the FBI Public Corruption Squad. And he appreciated all the hard work I did and what that group did. And he helped me get to Billings, Montana.
But before we go on to Billings, can you talk a little bit about that public corruption?
Sure. We of course, we always cooperated with the FBI and Customs, but the agencies were agencies unto themselves down there. And we were getting a ton of public corruption information from working our cases along the border. And of course, the ports of entry are rife for corruption, and the smaller municipality PDs in the state that are close to the border, there's always allegations of corruption. And we were getting a lot of that intel and just working it as normal drug investigations, thinking, hey, if there's bad people, we're going to get them. There's no reason to turn them over to the FBI. Well, the FBI realized we were getting all that intel, and they had that public corruption squad, and they wanted to cooperate and work with us. So I got sent over there for my last 2 years. Great assignment. My boss was Terry Moore. Got to work with some great FBI agents. One of them was Ed Morales, the hero of the Miami shooting. Great undercover. He's famous for that shootout in Miami, but the guy could write 5 books on his undercover work. Really incredible what the guy brought to our group and with other groups. Still friends with those agents I worked with, those FBI agents, and still in contact with Terry Moore, the former group supervisor.
Joe, so when you say public corruption for the audience, what does that entail? Is that other cops? Is that politicians? Is that what is public corruption? What kind of things?
All the above, but primarily we were targeting law enforcement officials that were involved in the drug trafficking business. And on the border, we arrested a Border Patrol dispatcher, we arrested a couple customs inspectors, we arrested a South Tucson police officer, all of them that were involved in the purchase, sales, and distribution of.
Oh, so it wasn't just a matter of kind of turning a blind eye, letting things cross the border. They were actually getting the drugs and selling them.
Some of them were involved in the actual sales.
Wow.
And we arrested one inspector down there that agreed to run a few loads and got paid, and then they ran 10 more loads through and didn't pay him because what was he going to do? He had no recourse, and eventually when we ended up catching up with him, he cooperated and detailed exactly how it worked. And
I'm curious about that, Joe. How does a person get approached, I'm assuming by cartel members, in order to start running drugs for them?
Well, a lot of people along the southwest border have relatives in Mexico. And like Nogales, Arizona, for all intents and purposes, it's just like being in Mexico. I mean, everybody speaks Spanish, the signs are all in Spanish, and there's a real cultural tie between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, or any other border town. And it wasn't unusual for an inspector to have his extended family over in Mexico when somebody would approach him and say, hey, you could make $7,000 if you tell us you're going to be on this line at this time. And they'd have pagers, and they'd page the crook, hey, line 2, 10 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock, line 2, they'd run a load through.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I'd say the vast majority of the drugs coming into the country come through the ports of entry.
Yeah. Okay.
Either through corruption or because they're so well concealed, or just the volume of traffic coming through those ports. The Border Patrol and Customs, and of course everything's combined now. At the time it wasn't. They just can't search everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you get transferred to Montana when? What year?
June of 2001.
Okay. You get there. Tell me the difference between the Tucson office and the Montana office. Did you say Billings at the time?
Billings.
Billings, okay.
Yes. Yeah, it was a big cultural shock for me because in Tucson, a lot of our cases were tied to Mexican cartels and long-term conspiracy investigations. One case, my partner and I worked down there, we were up on phones for a year and 7 months, one after another, on the same organization or different groups of that organization. And then I get to Billings, and a lot fewer agents. I think there were 4 of us in the office, or 5 at the time. No task force officers. And of course, the quantities and the type of investigations are different. Just as important, and I came to realize that very quickly. I mean, you go to eastern Montana and there's a drug dealer in Miles City and he's distributing drugs to kids and people there in that community. And if you can take him out, you've had a huge impact, not just in Miles City, but in eastern Montana. So the cases were smaller in terms of the amount of crooks we targeted and the amount of drugs, and also tended to be much shorter and not as complex.
Did you feel like moving to Montana, even though you were working on smaller cases, but kind of to your point, you take off a drug dealer in eastern Montana and it kind of stops. Do you feel like you were having a little bit more impact than you were in Tucson?
I don't think we as a group or as our office ever thought we weren't having an impact in Tucson, but it just never quit. I mean, that wall was coming, that
Right.
wave was always there. You'd do one case, and we used to joke, you're only as good as your last 90 days, because we put together some really good complex conspiracy investigations that involved wires and big indictments, and then you'd still be cleaning that up and you'd be on to the next one. So yeah, I never thought we weren't having an impact, but here in Montana, you can see it much more clearly. And like one of the last investigations I was involved in, I was the supervisor at the time, but we had an agent in Billings that was driving up to Great Falls, and it's 4-hour drive on a good day. And she was driving sometimes twice a week, 3 times a week. She'd stay up there, but she was driving back and forth, a ton of windshield time, working with the state and locals up there and with customs. And they had a group of Mexicans bringing in large quantities of meth, 5, 10, 15 pounds at a time. And she ended up writing a wire for that investigation. And they indicted over 20 people and seized, I think, over 20 pounds of meth. So and 20 pounds of meth is a good hit anywhere in the country,
Yeah.
let alone Great Falls. So, and it was a great cooperative effort between MDCI, Customs, DEA, the FBI, all the agencies that work out of Great Falls.
So DEA really relies on working with state and locals, and I'm sure you did that with people in Tucson. Getting to Montana, where it's a little bit smaller environment, I'm assuming that at that point you're heavily reliable or relying on state and locals. How was your relationship with them, and how did they view DEA?
Well, to go back to Tucson, when I first got there, we had maybe 15, 20 task force officers, border patrol agents in the office, and you just got used to working with other agencies, and you couldn't do the job without them. And our TFO program with DEA is probably one of the most powerful tools we have, just because we get some great people that they're assigned to DEA full-time, carry our badge, do our paperwork, and a lot of them quickly excel at the job and do outstanding work. So when I got to Billings, because guys were spread out across the state, nobody was really working with the local drug task force in Billings. And I went over and introduced myself and started working with them. And it involved the sheriff's department, the PD, the FBI, and a customs agent. And I worked with them for the next 8, 10 years, making one good case after another. Great cooperative effort. And,
Did they have, prior to you going over there, did they have any, I mean, I'm sure they did at some point, but did they have a established relationship with DEA prior to you showing up?
they did at one time. At one time, they'd been in our office, and then they left and became embedded with the FBI. And because we had so few agents, and Montana is a huge state geographically, agents were pulled to other parts of the state all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the relationship I had with state and locals in Tucson, when I got here, it was important to do the same. And
So good career in Montana?
yes, I spent 18 years here. I anticipated, my wife was doing her residency in Billings, and I thought 3-4 years, I'm going to put my boots on and move on. And I had friends overseas that were calling me. I had one buddy that called me, "What are you doing in Montana? You have ruined your career. And you had so much potential." And what I came to realize is the cases in Montana are just as important and have just as big an impact as any place else. And you could go into a small community and partner up with state and locals and really make a difference. And that became important for me.
Okay. How many total years in law enforcement did you have?
31 years, 6 months.
Okay. In those 31 years, do you think being in law enforcement, how did it affect your family?
It was hard when we were in Arizona. I can remember my wife telling me, "I can't depend on you for anything," and I'm like, "That's right, honey. The job comes first," because I was really dedicated to the job. And when she was in medical school and we had young kids, luckily there was a student aide in our office, Elizabeth Garate. I'm still good friends with her, and her mom ended up helping us with our kids when they were little, and basically adopted us into their family and invited us to all their holiday celebrations. And so that helped a lot. But there were a lot of nights that I'd tell my partner, because we'd run the wire room from 8 in the morning till midnight. And even though your shift was from 4 to midnight, sometimes they needed surveillance help at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you went in at 8, and I remember going home many a night at 8:30 just to give my kids a kiss, reading them a book, and get back in my truck and head back to work, and was glad to do it. And so it did have an impact on my family. But
Do you think if for sake of argument, if I went and talked to your wife and your kids, do you think they enjoyed what you did? And maybe enjoyed isn't the right word, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think they appreciate the fact that I worked for a great agency and was doing an important mission for the country and the community. I think they understood that. And I still tried to make it to as many baseball, basketball games and soccer games as I could, but you miss a lot.
Yeah.
And at the time, you don't think much of it because I was always goal oriented, and when you're working with other people, you don't want to let them down.
Yeah. Okay. From the time that you started to the time that you retired, I mean, we all have different values and how we see people and everything else. Do you think the way you see people changed over the years, or no, it's kind of the same? How did being in law enforcement affect kind of your view of people over that time?
That's a good question. Well, as a working agent, and I was a field agent for most of my career. The last 6 years I was in management, but as a field agent, you get a little jaded, and in some ways people would say you're jaded. I would almost say you just become more in tune to your environment, and you're more observant and able to pick things out quicker than other people. We dealt with bad people. I mean, people putting poison into communities and poison kids and destroying families. Nowadays, drugs seem to be okay with a lot of people, but they destroy families through drug addiction. I mean, our homeless problem right now, this whole thing with the legalization of marijuana, I think that has a huge impact on the homeless. And you talk to any parent that has a kid that is high on marijuana all the time and can't get out of bed and can't go to school and can't get good grades. I mean, it has an impact just not on the person using the drugs, but the family and the community. And you see that over and over and over again throughout your career. And yeah, you tend to have a different perspective than most people on what drug abuse and drug sales are.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about DEA is we were big on demand reduction. We spent, I had one agent in Montana that spent thousands of hours he probably spent 24 years in Montana, thousands of hours going to schools, health clinics. Anybody that wanted to be educated on drug abuse, drug addiction, he was out there trying to educate people. And I think that's important. Education is important for young people, family structure, cultural structure in terms of inner city drug sales and what goes on with the violence. And it's a tough equation. And DEA is in a very positive position, was and is, to have a good impact on that and help our country.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up because most people just see DEA as the enforcement arm, but there's a lot of people doing education, which has got to be, it has to be a component of what DEA does.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can't put enough people in jail. Do we have to put people in jail? Yeah, there's bad people running these criminal organizations, making millions of dollars at the expense of our communities and our children. And those people, the people that are part of the organization and the distribution rings, they need to be put in prison and put there for a long time. And then, of course, the addicts need to be helped. They need treatment. Our young people need education. And DEA's played a strong role in that.
Yeah.
And like I said, that one agent here in Montana, thousands of hours over the course of his career.
Yeah, I think that's important.
To that.
Yes. So 2 last questions for you, Joe. So we didn't hit on this, but I know that you have a sister that was in the FBI. So 2 questions, and maybe you can't answer this, and I'm hoping to talk with her as well. Obviously, your dad had a big effect on you guys. So do you think it was the same, if I asked her the same question about why she went into law enforcement that I did you, would she have the same answer? Or no, do you think she'd have something else? And the second question is, because she went into FBI, do you think your dad liked her more?
He was very proud of her, very proud of her. But she went to Penn State to school, all 3 of my sisters did. And then she worked for a while and then went to law school at Pittsburgh, University of Pitt, and got out and worked as an assistant district attorney in Pennsylvania, prosecuting. So she was a prosecutor, and she was there for about 2 years. And she called me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about going into federal law enforcement." I said, "Hey, good for you, Annie." And she said, "I'm going to apply to DEA." And I said, "That's great. I'd apply to DEA." But I said, "I'd apply to the FBI too, because with your law degree, you're very marketable. Not that DEA doesn't appreciate that, but you're very marketable with the FBI. I'd apply to them." So, of course, she applies, go through the process. And, of course, my dad's all excited, ends up going to the academy, gets out. He goes down for her graduation. And as part of her graduation gift, he gave her the signed picture of J. Edgar Hoover and the poem that he had presented to my dad way back when. So, and then I started getting the calls from Annie. "Hey, what do all DEA and FBI agents have in common?" And I said, "What's that, Annie?" She said, "They both applied to the FBI." So I get a lot of A lot of jokes.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So do you think it was the same thing though for her as why she went into law enforcement? Is that kind of influence of your dad?
Yes, yes. And she had a heck of a career. I mean, she was in New York, LA, headquarters, became 14, went to Alaska, ended up stepping down because my dad was very sick and she wanted to get her office a preference. And to get back to Pennsylvania, she had to come down as a senior 13. So she did to Allentown, Pennsylvania, and was working cases and was an affiant on a wire like a year before she retired, and she never slowed down. She was pushing,
a hard worker,
pushing hard the whole time.
She your younger sister?
Yeah, 5 years younger than me.
How many older sisters did you say you had? Two. So your older sisters, I'm assuming they didn't go into law enforcement, never had a desire to do that.
No, one's a forester and is still working. She works for the Department of Agriculture, and my other sister was a school teacher, and she's retired.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Joe, I really appreciate you chatting with me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.